Brian Pillman, Dark Side of the Ring episode, season 3 debuted last night on Vice Channel. Now, they did give us a sneak peek of part 1, first half of the show, on YouTube a couple days before, so I was able to check this out, and it basically got you all the way up to, I guess, signing with WWE after his car accident, and then it stopped. So we had to wait until last night to catch the full episode, and I watched it through, and yeah, it was crazy, man. There was a couple of things in here I wasn't aware of. I'm pretty educated in Brian Pillman history. I lived his whole career, and I remember it, and especially his death was one that has hit me hard. Now, I've talked about the Pillman death so many times over the years because one thing I've constantly repeated ever since 2010 when I did my very first video is that the Brian Pillman death opened the floodgates for deaths. I'm not saying he caused it, but he was the first one because his death was so shocking because prior to that, we had Eddie Gilbert, which was pretty shocking. Gino Hernandez, pretty shocking. Adrian Adonis, pretty shocking. Joey Morella, pretty shocking. The Von Erichs, super fucking shocking. But in terms of what was going on at the time in wrestling, a main star, regular roster member on TV with a pay-per-view match that day, dying like that was really kind of holy shit, you know, especially when you see Vince McMahon talking about it on the free-for-all and they got to go out there and do a show. And he was the first ever 10-bell salute. Brian Pillman was the first person that they ever put all the talent up there, put his picture on the screen and did the 10 bells. First time they ever did that was Pillman. And that was a very traumatic experience for a 20-year-old wrestling fan like myself that thought Brian Pillman, despite his ankle, had a chance to maybe even contend for the world title. You know, when he was about to be in this, finish off this big angle with Goldust, Marlena was going to turn heel and join with Brian Pillman. You could smell it. And, you know, you felt like he had some potential in his future and the rest of his time in WWE. But behind the scenes, his personal life was a mess and everything was going down there. And he died on October 5th on that Bad Blood debut, the same night Kane debuted and all of that. So it was not fun to go back and relive that. But it was fun to look back at some of his early career, and they got into a lot of that, and that stuff was good. You know, they talked about when he was a kid, all of the throat surgeries that he had, which we knew about. All sorts of great people were interviewed for this thing. Kim Wood was back, and Kim Wood is on that Brian Pillman DVD right there that they released back in like 2005 or 6 or something like that. That's a really good documentary. Now, it ain't as gnarly as this because it's not, it's not entitled Dark Side. They're trying to highlight Brian in a positive way. And a lot of the really, really gritty details that you hear about his life in Dark Side of the Ring, you're not going to hear about there, but you are going to get a pretty good look about his background and a lot of, how he came into the business. And Kim Wood was featured in that. He was back here to be interviewed, and he was a character. My God, Dave Meltzer was a big part of this. So was Jim Ross, Jim Cornette, and Stone Cold Steve Austin, among others, along with all 3 of Brian's kids, Danny, Brittany, and Brian Jr. And they did interview Melanie. Tore back Melanie. I was shocked when I saw her. I mean, I always knew that, she had problems and probably did a lot of drugs and stuff, but my God, have the drugs taken a toll on her? Man, sad and half infuriating at the same time, but we'll talk about Melanie. And I think the MVP of the episode has got to be Brian Pillman's sister, Linda, who seemed like she was there for him a lot. She was there for several things, like when Rochelle was attacked and stabbed, or I think when Rochelle killed herself, and when Brian Pillman had his accident, and she was always, kind of a glue in the family. And then it really touched me at the end of the documentary when she kind of revealed that she really works hard to make sure that all of the kids, because all of Brian's kids have different mothers. He has 3. I mean, technically he's got some stepkids too, technically 5, but 3 of his own, all with different mothers and different situations and a lot of bad blood. Brittany, Rochelle's daughter, hates Melanie. And as I'm watching this, I'm like, I wonder what the relationship is with the siblings. I mean, she can't stand Melanie. What's Brian's situation with Melanie? That's his mom. Obviously loves his mom, but he probably has some hard feelings towards her too. How is, are him and Brittany able to keep a close sibling relationship despite the fact that his sister hates his mom? What's that all like? And at the end of the piece, when they showed Linda kind of getting the kids together and they were all around the table looking at pictures and stuff, I got to commend all of Brian's kids for being able to have relationships with each other and not let the fucked up past that they were all unfortunate enough to be a part of damage that and hold it against each other. They even showed at the very end, Brian, hanging out with his mom, who clearly Brittany hates. and the fact that I can't even imagine. I mean, I have a half sister, and a full sister. I couldn't imagine if the situations were with one of our parents, or there was hatred or anything like that there. I don't know how it would go, and how that would be for a sibling. So as I'm watching the documentary, I'm wondering about that. I'm wondering that in my head. I'm like, God, I wonder, they're all being interviewed here, but they all seem to be in different places. Do they all get along? So at the end of it, when I kind of saw them all together, I'm like, that provides me a little bit of comfort to know that Brian, sees that. And, hopefully he's like, well, his kids are all adults and they're being strong through all this. They all have good hearts, and, the fact that they can all coexist is really cool. So I think Linda deserves a lot of credit. She's the MVP of that family, and she deserves to go in the Hall of Fame, if nothing else, for kind of keeping all that together and keeping Brian Pillman's memory alive, which his kids also do a great job of. Despite all of Brian's faults, every single one of his kids said that he was a great dad and that he loved him and he was there for him. The other situations like we'll talk about that went on with Rochelle and Melanie and Brian's, promiscuous lifestyle, the drug use, things like that. All those were there, but all of his kids remember him fondly, and that's good. I'm glad, that obviously Brittany had mentioned in the documentary that she does have some anger towards him, but, they still love their dad. And that was all kind of comforting at the end of that. But, to get to that point at the end was kind of some rocky road there. And they got into some serious shit. So they talked about his early, days, his early life, the throat operations, and then, playing football and Cincinnati Bengals and going to Calgary and all that. Got just caught up to speed on how all that took place. And then when he was up there and got injured and decided to go to the Hart family camp and learn how to wrestle, and broke in back then in the Stampede days. And I remember when I got my first tapes of Pillman in Stampede, because I've told the story a bunch of times. When I first started getting into tape trading, probably around like 97, 98, 99, I traded for some Stampede stuff. And a lot of what I was targeting was Bret Hart and Dynamite Kid from back in the day. But I got this like giant set to where it had like a lot of like Chris Benoit matches and Owen Hart matches and Brian Pillman matches. It was very cool. So that was kind of my first, that's as far back as I was able to see him. I never saw anything prior to that on Pillman. But back in WCW, he was like, when he got there in like 89 and 90, he was like one of their top baby faces. Everybody knew who Flying Brian was. I lived in the South. I lived in North Carolina at the time. And I remember the kids that watched wrestling. Yes, WWE was the big time, Hulk Hogan and all of that and Ric Flair and whatever. But you heard Flying Brian's name a lot. I heard Flying Brian's name from non-wrestling fans. I remember one of my friend's sisters, we were watching wrestling and she came down. She was, is that Flying Brian? And we were like, no, it's not Flying Brian. But she's like, oh, she just knew the name. She just saw two guys in the ring. Is that Flying Brian? And so he was, he was over his shit. He got great reactions from the crowd and all that stuff. So they chronicled all that. His tag team was Steve Austin. Very cool to see Stone Cold on this thing, talking about the chain, that Brian gave him. And I remember he wore that forever. He'd wear that on Raw so often and shit. So it was cool to see him on there. But with all the lighthearted stuff, they also, had to get a little bit dark and talk about his personal life and how he had, multiple girlfriends. And I guess it was when he was with Rochelle, who got pregnant with Brittany. While she was pregnant with Brittany, Brian had already had a previous relationship and had a daughter, Danny. But her mom didn't let Brian know about it until a couple of years. And then when she did, Brian found out he had another daughter. And then he was cheating on Rochelle with Melanie, who they showed footage of the wedding and all of that. And talked about how they met, and then Melanie was, fucking crazy. And then he got with her. She was pregnant with little Brian. And then, they were all kind of living together. And then there became a custody battle with Rochelle. And Brian and Melanie had all the money and they were threatening her. And that horrible story that Brittany told about how her mom showed up to say hi to her. And she gave her a hug. And then Brian came out and there was like a tug of war with the kid and screaming and just fucking white trash heaven, And the poor kid have to fucking go through that, and to live with that memory has got to be so hard. And, Rochelle, fell into a lot of depression because I can't remember. Did they say that Brian got custody or they were about to or whatever? It was looking dark for her because, after that attempted kidnapping thing, I think it was, that Brian got the kid. And Melanie was a big part of that because she was egging Brian on, and she was the one kind of pushing for this a lot. And she didn't like Melanie. She didn't like Rochelle. Linda said that, Melanie didn't like anybody talking to Brian. This is the mother of one of his kids. He's going to have contract with her. Then, of course, I hate to say it, but women are crazy, you know, and Melanie was probably very territorial, and she was probably doing everything she could in her power to ruin Rochelle. And she drove her so damn crazy that she ended up committing suicide, shot herself. And, this contradicted what was said in the DVD, because I remember in the DVD, Melanie is on there too. She looks a lot less tore back than she does in this. I think at the time of this DVD, she was remarried to apparently what was a pretty big douchebag, a dickhead stepfather for Brian Jr., according to him. I think that's when that was filmed. And in that, she did mention Rochelle, but I thought she had said something along the lines of, that Brittany was kind of like her daughter, like her, like she had kind of adopted her. And maybe that was the case when Brittany was little. They even told the story of Brian's funeral, how all the little girls are running around screaming and having a good time and stuff. So maybe she was too little, to understand how responsible Melanie was for what happened to her mom. And maybe the relationship was good at first, but then as Brittany grew older and became an adult and learned what happened, then it broke up. But whatever, in the DVD, Melanie makes it sound like their relationship is good and she's kind of like her stepmom now. I guess that's not the case. So when Brittany started saying Melanie's a piece of shit and she deserves everything she got and she's a drug addicted asshole, I'm like, oh, whoa. It's that's not what I thought. I knew Melanie and, and everything that went on with Rochelle and her suicide. I knew about that, and I knew that she was probably driven to that, but I didn't realize that Brittany's kind of aware of what happened, and we say bad things about Melanie, and there's very little redeeming qualities about her. Even back in the day, she was a street dancer, probably just on her. She was an exotic dancer, and Brian met her, and she was, probably lived a wild lifestyle, probably been doing drugs her whole life, and it showed. Girl's missing a tooth, and she just looks like she's been on meth for the past 25 years. Unbelievable. But with that being said, she was honest, and she owned it, and she did not shy away. She certainly didn't try to pretend, that she didn't look like, she'd been doing crack for 2 decades. She owned up to her, mistakes. She feels extremely guilty about what happened to Rochelle. She expressed the desire to make it up to the kids, which I don't think, based on Brittany's demeanor in this thing, that's ever going to happen. Brittany says that she's living the life that she deserves right now because nobody likes her, and she's ruined her life with drugs and alienated everybody, and is probably living a pretty rotten life of depression herself. Made mention that Melanie has taken all of Brian's royalties that she gets, annually every year, and none of his kids ever saw any of that money, and she spent it on drinking and partying. And Melanie kind of was like, yeah, I kind of did. So, at least Melanie's honest. At least she's not trying to bullshit herself or us. And she's owning it. And part of you wants to respect that. But part of you is like, come on, get your shit together, man. So it was disturbing to see her on there because, think about back in the day, she was pretty. When she was on the gun episode, when she was standing there with Brian, of course, she had the big, giant, metal band hair. But she, looked like someone that hadn't just been on drugs for a bunch of years yet. And to see how such a beautiful person, can become so unbeautiful due to putting that shit in your body, it sucks, man. And I think, and if the kids, especially Brian, really suffered for this. And he got into some pretty graphic details here later on after we would talk about Brian's death. But very cool stuff talking about Brian's contract status back in the day, because I remember the hotlines and shit when Brian was starting to kind of fly off the rails a little bit in WCW, kind of doing this loose cannon thing, doing the Booker Man shit. And then you hear about his release. And I think he was even turned up in the crowd on WCW after his release. So a lot of that stuff was happening. And I remember the hotlines and shit really were a little bit confused, but they were speculating that he's working everybody and he'll probably turn up in ECW or something like that. I remember that speculation taking place. I loved the story about him, or how they kind of classified it as him manipulating Eric Bischoff to get a release. Now, Kim Wood takes an awful lot of credit for this. In the story here, he says that, what you got to do is increase your value, because Brian had a lot of kids and his contract was coming up for renegotiation or something, and he wanted more money and Bischoff couldn't give it to him. So Kim Wood kind of convinces Brian to kind of play both sides against each other and, try to convince Eric because of this work and because of this crazy, kooky, loose cannon character to give him his release, like a legitimate release. He's like, because you don't understand, if I talk to Dave, it's got to be real. It's got to be real. So they made it sound like Bryan manipulated Eric to get a release, when really I think the intent was, according to Eric Bischoff, who's also on this, by the way, that he intended to get released so he could go to WWE, build himself up, and come back for more money. And I remember when, after Brian Pillman died and the following years, there were a lot of people in shoot interviews that said Brian Pillman wanted to go back. At the time of his death, he was wanting to go back to WCW. So Bischoff kind of verifies this a little bit, saying, wow, Brian Pillman, because Pillman was really out of place in WWE. It is a little bit weird that he died there, because he was only there a year, prior to his death, a little bit, maybe a year and a half total, but he was off TV a lot with surgeries and shit. So, on TV and a presence on TV, it was only about a year. So for him to die under their umbrella and not WCW's was a little weird. And especially when you hear about him only using WWE as a way to get to more money in WCW, feeling that WCW was the better place for him. All of that got verified here in Dark Side of the Ring. I had heard that throughout the years, but was surprised when I heard it. I'm like, oh, I thought Brian Pillman liked being in WWE. I thought he liked being a part of the Hart Foundation. I thought, I loved Brian Pillman being there. Had he not got hurt, or had he not gotten hurt, and he would have been healthy coming in the door and being able to, be, the athletic star that he was before, I would have loved to see like a 97 Shawn and a 97 Pillman go at it, especially like on the mic. Shawn's so edgy and badass and old school. He might be slightly better than Pillman on the mic per se, but he ain't as badass and he ain't as crazy. And Shawn Michaels would have met his match with this guy, because there ain't no way he'd let Shawn talk to him like that, and he would beat the fuck out of him. So I would have loved to see those two, like a healthy Pillman, a healthy Shawn. You talk about a clash. Shawn, of course, politically would have buried the guy back behind the scenes, and Vince would have chosen Shawn over Brian 100%, and Brian would have gotten beat, but it would have been cool, to see the two of them in the ring together, kind of having that back and forth, and, Brian just being, the hardcore fans would be 100% behind Brian. And I thought that would have been a cool storyline to see, or a cool program between the two, but it was not to be. But leading up to all of that, Bischoff kind of verifies that stuff. And apparently the intent here is for Brian to leave, work in WWE for a couple years, come back to WCW where he can be paid that big money. So he gets the release. He then turns up in ECW. And I remember when he turned up there, that was awesome. That was all over the place. And the fans knew it. Even the crowd, even the fans in the arena that night knew that he was going to be there. And then when he showed up and they all popped, he turned around and heeled on him on the mic. That was fucking awesome. So you knew he was going to show up there, and it was only a matter of time before he'd hop over to WWE. But then the accident happened, and he had that Hummer, and he fell asleep at the wheel because he's taken a ton of pills and shit, and somas or whatever, muscle relaxers, fell asleep, flipped the thing, apparently got tossed from the vehicle, 50 yards or whatever it was, and flipped in the air, and all sorts of crazy shit, landed, smashed his face to hell, and just completely destroyed his ankle. Now, remember when I heard about the injury, they were pretty graphic here in detail, how they talked about how his face had to be reconstructed, peeling his scalp back. This is Brutus Beefcake shit here, and the way they describe these injuries, and the fact that Beefcake and Brian Pillman both remain good-looking dudes after this. When Beefcake, he had all that stuff done, but he didn't have a mangled face afterwards. He pretty much looked the same. So the fact that they were able to put Brian back together without all these crazy scars and these crushed bones and these out-of-place eyeballs and stuff, like the fact that he was able to come back together, it's medicine, fucking doctors are amazing, man. But the biggest issue there, not only his face, was what happened to his ankle. And his ankle just got completely shattered to where they even had to talk about amputation. So they put everything back together with steel rods and screws all in his ankle and his leg, to where they were even sticking out of the skin during his recovery. And of course, his face was all banged up. His kids described, them seeing and interacting with their dad and how it kind of freaked them out, how messed up he was. And at this time, this is in between his contracts, but Vince, and it was so crazy when they signed him, they signed him anyway. WWE, it was that, that, as Cornette put it, that burgeoning Monday Night War. And they wanted to ensure that they could get everybody they could, because at that time when Pillman came in, they were losing guys. Pillman came in like right before or after WrestleMania 12, and Hall and Nash were leaving. They were gone. A lot of other guys were gone too. Even Warrior would be taken off. So they were losing a ton. I think Vince felt that he didn't want to lose this guy. He didn't want to potentially lose Brian Pillman, especially since Brian is kind of, kayfabe in the injury a little bit, not being totally honest about how fucked up he really is. And I think they're thinking he can get back in the ring and just be a name for them, because as we've talked about a lot, and as we will talk about on Sunday in the King of the Ring 1996 review, WWE and WCW had swapped rosters around this time. Now Hogan and Savage and Hall and Nash and Piper and Perfect and guys and Brett and shit, or not Brett yet, we're all in WCW, while in WWE, Johnny B. Bad, Dustin Rhodes, Cactus Jack, Vader, Stunning Steve Austin, all these guys were now in, as Sid, were all in WWE. It was like a little talent swap there. So Pillman coming in, I thought made a lot of sense. And then he went nuts in the contract signing with Gorilla Monsoon and J.J. Dillon and all that stuff. They didn't show that on the documentary, but after Pillman so graciously signed his contract, he goes nuts in the contract signing there. And then we're going to talk about this on Sunday. They showed it here in the documentary, the little brush by that the two guys had, Steve Austin and Brian Pillman at the King of the Ring. I thought that was great. Watched that live on pay-per-view. I'm like, the Hollywood Blondes, check them out. They're looking at each other. And Pillman's great promo that night. So they covered a lot of that stuff here and about how fucked up he was. And then they got into the injury angle they did with Austin, attacking Brian Pillman, Pillmanizing his ankle. First time we ever saw that spot done with the chair was in that, and that was on Super. That wasn't even on Raw. That was on Superstars when Austin beat up Brian. So they got into a lot of his WWE run there, but talked about that when he did finally come back and get in the ring. And I remember that was like the summer of '97. He had a match on Raw with Steve Austin. They had like a brawl backstage at King of the Ring, and Austin gave him a swirly at King of the Ring. And I think he was in the Intercontinental title tournament as well. I think he faced Owen Hart, and they kind of had like a fake match against each other. I remember that. And then he had the feud with Goldust that was at SummerSlam that involved wearing the dress. And then they had the match, I think it was at Ground Zero, where Marlena was on the line, and Brian Pillman beat Goldust and took possession of Marlena for 30 days. And then they were set to have a rematch at In Your House Bad Blood, from what I understand, the plan there was for Pillman to beat Goldust, because Goldust had beat him at SummerSlam, then Pillman won. I think Pillman was going to, at the next one, then Pillman was going to win the blow-off. And I think the plan was for Marlena to turn on Goldust, join with Pillman, that would transform Goldust into more of that Dustin Rhodes character that they would still wind up doing after Pillman died, when they brought him together and did that series of like sit-down interviews with Dustin and Mick Foley and maybe someone else. So that was all a part of that, and that's such a weird fucking time. So now, we've pretty much covered everything up until, his death, and now we get to Bad Blood. And to hear Bruce Pritchard, another person who was interviewed for this, and Jim Cornette retell this. Cornette was pretty consistent with what I've heard him tell in interviews before. He was the one that I guess had sought out to try to track down Brian when it was realized he was extremely late for the pay-per-view, and he ended up calling the hotel. And when he asked about Pillman, they put him on hold, and they came back and they said, Brian Pillman's dead. And he kind of told somebody, go get Bruce right fucking now. Brian Pillman's dead. And, to hear Cornette tell that again and to see him get choked up about it, to this day, how long it's been for him to retell that story and to really struggle to get through it. It was crazy. And I remember, me and my buddy Daniel were watching this shit. I think I was going to his house or something like that, and it was announced on the free-for-all. I think like on the fucking preview channel, that blue scrolling crawl, that you would have watched pay-per-views back in the day. And Vince makes that announcement there. And like I said earlier, it was kind of like my first introduction to like a major death like that. After that, it became commonplace. Owen Hart, Rick Rude, Kurt Hennig, Davey Boy Smith, Crash Holly, Miss Elizabeth, Hawk, the list just goes on and on. Big Boss Man, everybody, just day after day, people were dying left and right. It all started here with Brian. So to have to retell that story about how they found out he passed away and that he was found, dead in his bed. I remember that very passionate, shoot style promo Cornette did on Raw about Phil Mushnick, who wrote an article about Brian Pillman talking about, substance abuse and everything in wrestling, and really fired back hard on Mushnick in a classic fucking interview. But Brian and Jim Cornette were really, really good friends. So, to hear him retell this was rough. Like Jim Cornette or not, I certainly don't agree with literally anything he says about AEW. I think he does it for the views and the the enraged little psychos that have so much pent up anger that they live to hear that stuff and they literally jack off to it. He's doing it for them. So it's nice to see that he actually does have a heart in there. And retelling that was probably pretty hard for him because of the relationship with Brian and the whole situation there. So that was when I realized, oh, man, I thought it was going to be easier to get through this, and so the way they kind of wrapped up the story with Brian's kids, to me, at least, wrapped up everything well. I think it's got to be tough for all of them. They're all dealing with a lot. There's a lot of baggage here, and there's a lot of, there's probably just a lot of emotion just wrapped up in all of this, so that's why I said earlier, what made me so happy about the end of this was when, kind of Linda is the one that kind of keeps this family together and gets them together and tries to ensure that these siblings don't drift apart and, maintain good relationships. And it seems like they have. And Brian is even, Brian was on the documentary talking about his relationship with his mother and how he's, trying to at least have a relationship with her and he's trying to get over some of the issues he had. So they're trying to do the right thing here, which is good. Apparently things are really hard for Brian Jr. as well. I was not aware. I knew that Melanie remarried. I remember hearing about it when Melanie remarried. But I had no idea that this guy is apparently some sort of a douchebag that abused Brian. I don't know why or what the motivation would be for Brian to lie here. So I'm going to take him at face value. They mentioned in the documentary that they reached out to the former stepdad and he declined to do the interview. But Brian Jr. accused him of physically, not only mentally, but physically and verbally abusing him, which sucks because when you hear about that, it makes your blood boil. Because I don't know who the stepdad is, but I'll guarantee you right now. Imagine what little Brian was probably thinking. If my dad was here, you would be so fucked. Brian Pillman's a tough dude, that wouldn't fly. I mean, I bet you Brian dreamt of that every day. If my dad was here, he would fuck this guy up. So if this stepfather, whatever his fucking name is, if he was abusing Brian Jr. like that, that's absolutely inexcusable. And, it goes with the territory of when you have a drug addicted mother, she's not exactly going to be marrying, saints. She's probably going to be, mixing it up with some unsavory people and some pretty big assholes that aren't good for kids and shit. So seems to me that all the kids are relatively well adjusted. Brittany seems like to be the one with the most issues. Danny seems to have it together just fine. And Brian Jr. is, of course, attempting to have a career in professional wrestling. He works for AEW. He's done an absolutely marvelous job of emulating his father's look and his father's style. He looks exactly like him. And I think we all need to root for him because so far so good. He was, I noticed him in MLW. I'm like, holy shit. He looks a lot like nobody can duplicate Brian Pillman Senior, but Brian Jr. is doing it pretty well, and he's got that mullet down. He's got that look. You can see Brian in his face, and that is a fan for me and somebody who remembers literally everything about Brian Pillman's career. That makes me happy, and and that's another thing that Cornette mentioned on this episode as well. About Pillman Jr. carrying on his father's legacy and how he wishes him the best. And I'm like, man, how can you be on your fucking podcast and say the shit that you say about AEW when you claim to love Brian Pillman so much? How can you so harshly and so negatively and so angrily root against a place for Brian Pillman's son to get a job and to be in the business and make money and to make a living? I don't think Brian Pillman, your friend, would be too happy with the way you're shitting on this promotion, a place, a North American promotion that is able to give wrestlers a place to work other than Vince. Only the biggest assholes walking this earth could find problems with that, find negativity there. That's a good thing. So it amazes me how Cornette can be here crying about Brian Pillman, wishing Junior the best when he completely shits on the show that Junior works on every week just to please his audience. For no other reason, just to please his audience who need that negativity in their life to survive, who need to hear that to ejaculate every morning and get on with their day. That's disturbing above anything else, for me with this documentary is to hear Cornette be two different people here. But anyway, all in all, Really good documentary, tough to watch, and I put it right up there with Owen and Benoit. Those are the three big ones so far on Dark Side of the Ring. We have Nick Gage coming up next week. I only know that, but I'm not sure the order of the other ones. We got Chris Kanyon on this list. We got The Plane Ride from Hell. We got Ultimate Warrior. We got lots of others. There's going to be some good episodes this season, but they opened it up with the biggest one here, and, there you go. There's my opinion on the Dark Side of the Ring.